Yeah, while we're figuring out slides, we can quickly kind of get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Ayush Rajshekharan. I'm from the Lotus team. And I'm very excited to be here, part of FIL Toronto, and part of kind of this half-day block of programming that we have that's implementation focused. It's really cool to hear from the Forest folks whom we just heard from, and I'm very excited to kind of talk about what it means to be an implementation of Filecoin. Obviously, I think it kind of goes without saying that the implementations themselves are fundamental to the tech we're building and the work that we're all doing, but it's nice to have some focus time to talk about what it's like to work on these teams, what the challenges we face are, forward-looking, what we hope to be doing, and so on. So thank you to Phil Swan and Filecoin Orbit for putting this event together and having us all here. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And if you are viewing this recording on the internet while stuck on a bus somewhere, thank you for your interest in Filecoin and in Lotus in particular. Perfect, so we're getting slides set up, but I titled this presentation Intro to Lotus, which is an obviously vague title. So maybe I'll explain the motivation first to kind of kick us off. Depending on where you are in the Filecoin ecosystem today, or where you're planning on joining the Filecoin ecosystem in the weeks and months to come, there's a high probability, not a certainty, but a high probability that a Lotus node will be involved in your life somewhere. Maybe you're a storage provider who runs Lotus every day and know how that can sometimes be an interesting process. Or maybe you're building a chain explorer that's potentially querying a Lotus API endpoint, and that's your source of data. Or maybe you've never even heard of the phrase Lotus, but you're storing data on Filecoin using some tool like Estuary that in turn is using the Lotus SDK behind the scenes. So given Lotus's somewhat prominent role in Filecoin today, I thought it would be nice to talk about what Lotus is, and really what the work that goes into building something like Lotus is. I think that's a cool piece of information to share. And if at the end of this presentation you decide that your life goal is to work on Lotus, that would be fantastic, and we should talk after. Given that this is very much just an informational, the goal is just to kind of get to know each other better, I'm very happy to be interrupted at any point if you have questions or just points of information that you want to share. Feel free to interrupt and break my flow. That'll be fun. I think that'll make this a good talk. Cool. Before we get started, it's very nice to be here in the city of Toronto. I'm very lucky to call this city my home. I know a lot of us here also do, whereas others are guests. But we should acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Turtle Island has been the home of various First Nation and Métis people for dozens of centuries. It continues to be that home today and will be for centuries to come, and we are grateful for the opportunity to be able to gather on their land. So cool, let's talk about Lotus. To talk about Lotus, you obviously start with Filecoin. Filecoin is a crypto-powered storage network aiming to be the storage network of Web3. And I really like the mission of Filecoin that we have there, which is to create a decentralized, efficient, and robust foundation for humanity's information. And I wanted to start with this because, as you can imagine, a lot of the work that goes into Lotus is based on kind of that mission statement there. We are one of the many teams working to deliver that mission. Filecoin is doing well and growing with every passing day. We've seen these stats a lot, but if you haven't before, the Filecoin network now has 16.6 exabytes of total network storage power, which makes it one of the largest storages of information in human history. That is where Filecoin is today. We've got over 4,000 storage providers, over 9,000 contributors on GitHub, and we're not slowing down, which is why we're all gathered here in Toronto today. Filecoin is very, very multifaceted, and implementations like Lotus often have to play different roles depending on how people are using your software. So Lotus is somewhat focused on the blockchain and protocol and network bubbles that we see in the right over there, in the left over there. But folks who are perhaps building apps on the Filecoin network are probably going to be interacting with Lotus somewhere in the background. So this is kind of the giant picture that Lotus has to participate in. And so with all of that, what is Lotus? Well, we call Lotus the reference implementation of Filecoin. What that means has kind of changed over the years. It is the implementation that kind of had the most time and attention as we launched 2.5 years ago. And so it has the most users today. But what it means to kind of play as a reference implementation has changed over time. Today, I consider one of the most important things that Lotus as reference implementation can do is bolster the other implementations, help drive adoption, provide feedback, and generally steer users and differentiating factors towards implementations like Forest and Venus, because that is critical to the overall security and usability of Filecoin. So that's what Lotus is. Now, if we and that already motivates a lot of what we have to do on the Lotus team is implementing Filecoin. So we can talk about what makes Filecoin Filecoin and the challenges that arise from that. But really, the question starts one level higher, I think, and we can start at what does it mean just to be an implementation of a blockchain? And I think this is probably the place to start, putting Filecoin entirely aside, and even considering a simpler blockchain. Kind of comes down to a few key tasks. You need to correctly implement the protocol. That's probably, if there's a single small kernel you can identify, it's that. Whatever your protocol is, you need to correctly implement it. So if you have a proof of work blockchain, you need to be correctly ensuring that whatever solutions folks are giving you in their block headers are in fact meeting the minimum hash requirement for that block. And that's kind of your starting point. I think it goes without saying that Filecoin's protocol is a little bit more complicated than that, and so the work involved is a little bit more. But sure, so if you have that, okay, you are now an implementation of a protocol, but you probably have to do more in order to be useful. At the very least, you probably want to be identifying peers and syncing the blockchain. So there is a strong peer-to-peer component here, because if not, you're not actually going to be following whatever blockchain you're trying to implement. With that, you probably want to be useful in terms of identifying information about the state of the chain. So you probably want to be exposing some API, CLI endpoint, some way to view the chain state, figure out what the balance of a certain account is, what block number we're on, that kind of thing. And third, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but you probably want to be able to send transactions. We call them messages in Filecoin, but you probably want to be able to sign and send these kind of fundamental transfers of balance onto the network. The third point that I had here is support users in the community, and I wanted to make this explicit. It kind of goes without saying on some level. Anyone who's building a piece of software has to be supporting their users, whether that's with documentation or troubleshooting or identifying scope for improvement. But I do think implementations of blockchains are kind of at an interesting place here, because you often wind up being, to your users, the face of the protocol itself. And this, while working within the implementation, we always try to be really careful to keep this distinction between Lotus, the implementation, and Filecoin, the protocol, because folks on the implementation teams are by no means fully steering the Filecoin protocol. But to your users, that difference is often academic, if not entirely irrelevant to them. And so you wind up having to provide a lot of support for the blockchain protocol itself. If you have some major network upgrade coming on, your users are going to be asking you information about what's in that upgrade, even if what's in the upgrade isn't that relevant to the software that you're building directly. Maybe you're consuming someone else's work. So I do find that this takes a lot of time and is one of the key responsibilities that falls on kind of implementation teams, and it's also often the most fun work, because you get to communicate good news, basically. So yeah, so if you are an implementation of a blockchain, you are probably doing all of these things. Now, Filecoin is obviously a little bit more than your average blockchain. It's obviously got more, its protocol is more complicated than just proof of work. It also is a product. The goal of Filecoin is to be able to store humanity's most valuable information, which means if you are implementing Filecoin, you probably want to also be providing this functionality. You want to be providing the functionality to commit and to prove storage. You want to be able to perform storage and retrieval deals, so you're probably receiving data from some storage client, and then sealing that into a sector. Sealing is basically the process of running Filecoin's proof of replication algorithm. And then you want to prove that storage every 24 hours, because that is the chief statement of Filecoin is the storage is verifiable because it is continually proved. And you perhaps also want the functionality to be able to produce blocks and earn block rewards for all of that storage that you've committed to Filecoin. And Lotus does deliver on all of these. Lotus or its dependencies delivers on all of these promises. So I think that's kind of our zoomed out view on what does an implementation have to do, and kind of defines Lotus's mission statement. Like, this is the goal that the team building Lotus has to be working on. Any questions or any thoughts before we keep moving? Cool. We'll have time for Q&A at the end as well. So jumping back to this, now if we're saying Lotus is a reference implementation of Filecoin, that means we are tasked with doing all of these things. At this point, and this is maybe a little pedantic, but it does become somewhat necessary to draw a distinction between Lotus, the software, and the Lotus team, which is a team building that software, or the set of cats building that software. Because the Lotus team does work on a little bit more than just Lotus, the piece of software itself. So diving into that, I've identified kind of these big 4 areas of what we spend our time working on. Naturally, number 1 is Lotus itself, where we can define Lotus itself as the node implementing this protocol. So the peer-to-peer component lies in here, as does kind of the usability. Can Lotus be used to query information about the Filecoin blockchain? That's one of the kind of 4 chief things that we do, and we'll go into each of these 4 in some detail. Number 2, that some, but potentially not everyone here is familiar with, is actors. Actors, informally speaking and slightly inaccurately speaking, actors, or the built-in actor suite, are kind of like precompiled contracts, to use an Ethereum term, in the Filecoin ecosystem. So this is the code that both defines and implements the Filecoin protocol. So just as an example, if you have when you create a storage miner, because you are interested in storing data on Filecoin, a storage miner actor is created for you, and it is that's the code that's checking things like, have you correctly submitted your proof, and are you proving this data every 24 hours? Similarly, there's a storage market actor that maintains deals. If you are a storage client creating a deal, you will interact with this storage market actor, and so on. And the Lotus team, we'll get into this in some detail, but the Lotus team was maintaining this repo kind of exclusively, and we're moving into a much more collaborative direction that we're all interested in. Piece number 3 is the Lotus miner and the Lotus worker. So this is the binary that basically is responsible for sealing and proving storage. So if as we mentioned earlier, Filecoin has additional functionality. So this is the binary that's basically responsible for receiving data, sealing that data into these sectors, making sure everything is correct there. This is a computationally complex and intensive process with a lot of scope for things to go wrong. And then proving that data onto the chain, and every 24 hours continuing to prove that data. Additionally, the Lotus miner is also what wins blocks on the Filecoin network. So every block that's coming in on the network can be produced by the Lotus miner. And piece number 4 is the community, as I mentioned. For better or for worse, Lotus has the most users today, and therefore a lot of information about developments in the Filecoin protocol, as well as Lotus itself, is communicated to the community through the folks on the Lotus team. So I want to dive into each of these 4 in a bit more detail, primarily focusing on what makes it interesting, because I find my job very interesting, and I think everyone on our team really likes the work we do, and I'd like to explain why. Like, why the problems we solve are challenging, why the work is stimulating, and why we're all here. So what does the Lotus node itself do? We kind of touched on this already. Find and communicate with peers, executes messages to validate the chain, so any transactions that have been received get executed in the Lotus node, and you make sure that consensus is reached across all your peers. APIs to query chain state, as I mentioned. The Lotus node has a message pool, which is basically a pool of transactions waiting to land on the Filecoin blockchain, and it maintains those messages. And if connected to a Lotus miner, messages are selected from the message pool for inclusion on chain. It also has an internal wallet for easy access to funds as needed, and so this is what allows you to quickly send messages, transfer balance, create new actors, and so on. So what's interesting about this? I think this part is relatively common to any implementation of a blockchain. The Lotus node sits at that boundary of trusted and untrusted input. I'm sure the Forest folks are familiar with this as well, where you do not know what input, you do not know your peers, you do not trust your peers, you do not know whether the input they're giving you is good or bad. So when you first connect to a peer, the very first thing they send you may be some malicious message designed to crash your node. And so there's a level of hypersecurity needed at that that trusted boundary that often provides Lotus with its biggest challenges. It requires a good amount of diligence when you're building Lotus, and I'm not going to lie, we don't always get it right at the building, testing, and deployment stage, so it also requires the ability to quickly respond to confidential bug disclosures or reports when something around that boundary is violated. Point number 2 is also very common to blockchain implementations. It's just scalability. Filecoin blockchains in general grow, and Filecoin is no exception to that. And so building something that can be resilient across the now 2.5 years of 2 years of the Filecoin blockchain and can continue to serve its purpose in the years to come as the chain grows provides a lot of fundamental challenges. And this is actually a big theme for the second half of this year. A big focus for the Lotus team for the second half of the year is more completely and adequately solving that problem. Third challenge is the correctness of the protocol implementation itself, because the Lotus, as an implementation, there is protocol level stuff that you do have to implement correctly, lest you violate some of the rules of the protocol and either be open to vulnerabilities or wind up on kind of side chains and stuck in loose consensus with your peers. And so that is certainly an ongoing challenge. Built-in actors, as I was mentioning, so these are kind of these precompiled contracts that we have to execute the Filecoin protocol. I gave the examples of the storage miner and the storage market actor. This is a lot of code. Folks who have worked on it can attest to that. A lot of code that needs to be very, very carefully tested because in many ways this is the Filecoin protocol. This code used to live in a repo called specs actors because it was the specification of the Filecoin protocol in many ways. And so the degree of testing and validation that is needed for this code is very, very high. So for anyone who has ever liked obsessively thinking about every aspect of every line of code that you write, built-in actors is a great place to be working at because that level of paranoia is well warranted when working on a piece of software like this. So the specs actors repo that I mentioned used to be written in Golang, and that was the version of these actors that was used by the Go-based implementation, so Lotus and Venus. The Forest team from ChainSafe built their own version of this, fully matching compatibility in Rust. And so they were using that in the Forest team. And that distinction kind of lives as of today, but in 18 hours from now, the Filecoin network will be upgrading to version 16, at which point we're all switching to using this Rust-based suite called the built-in actors, which is run through the new Filecoin virtual machine. And so as of tomorrow, this will not be a sole Lotus responsibility anymore, and we're very excited for that. And yeah, excited for the opportunity for a wider group of people to be collaborating on this like core piece of the Filecoin protocol. Challenges around working on built-in actors. The first one, determinism, is really fun because this isn't one that we always think about. But when you're working in blockchains, consensus is making sure you never lose consensus for any reason is obviously very, very important. And so you need to be very, very sure that you always get exactly the same result. So there cannot be any scope for non-determinism in this suite. And that's something that I have not experienced necessarily. That's not a problem I'd worried about outside of working on blockchains and places like this. Apart from that, security and correctness is obviously important, given that this is the Filecoin protocol. This is also the most performant critical part of the system because this code is run by every single node validating the Filecoin blockchain, and therefore any areas, in particular any areas to be unpredictably slow, opens an attack vector where folks can send malicious messages that then run through that slow piece of code and slow down or halt the entire Filecoin blockchain. So. This is the most. This is the piece of the Filecoin of the broader Lotus team's work where you really, really have to be particular about what you're doing, and that leads to some fun challenges. Any thoughts or questions before we move on?
I have a quick question.
Yep.
How do you penalize malicious nodes on the network? Can you please elaborate?
Sure. So I think it'll come down to what does it mean to be a malicious node. So we can use a couple examples. One example of a malicious node is just someone that's trying to trick you into giving you a wrong picture of the Filecoin blockchain. So it's trying to convince you that actually, this other side chain with some other miners on it are the winning chain. The process there is just so a lot of this relies on libp2p, which is the underlying peer-to-peer technology that Filecoin is based on, or at least that Lotus Lotus is built on. And so so that comes down to trying to find consensus from across your peers, not fully trusting any of them until you've fully validated it, and then dropping peers that seem to be giving you a wildly different picture or a picture that you know for a fact is wrong. There's also a lot of spam protection. The message pool that I mentioned is one of the most vulnerable pieces of Lotus to spam, because anyone can send any number of messages to the message pool. And again, we rely on libp2p, which has like a score maintaining system in order to just drop connections from peers that seem to be wasting your time or wasting your resources. Yep, thanks for the question. Cool, we'll keep moving. The Lotus Miner, the biggest and in many, well, I don't know about biggest, but one of the most complex pieces of software that I've gotten to work on. So the Lotus Miner really makes possible the promise of the Filecoin network. And this, again, bringing Filecoin as a product, Lotus Miner delivers that. So it receives data from storage clients that have already negotiated a deal. It receives that data, calls into our proofs libraries, which are written in Rust, in order to provably, replicate the data, and then commits those proofs onto the blockchain for nodes to verify. This involves 7 steps, depending on how you count, 7 different sealing tasks that are computationally intensive in different aspects. So some are more GPU intensive, some are more memory intensive. And so if you're building out a more kind of production grade Filecoin storage providing service, you probably have a variety of machines that specialize in different aspects of this task. And so it becomes a Lotus miner's job to make sure that the right pieces of your machine are working on the right tasks in a well-pipelined way, and this is not an easy problem to solve. The Lotus miner also proves all of those active sectors, again, a sector being a unit of data every 24 hours, and can attempt to win blocks based on the pledged data. So winning blocks in Filecoin is kind of a lottery-based system, depending on the amount of data that you've pledged. So based on the data that your Lotus miner knows that you've pledged, it can, every 30 seconds, every epoch, try to win a block, and if it does, it submits that block out onto the Filecoin network, and hopefully you win some block rewards from it. Obviously, another foundational part of the Filecoin blockchain. Challenges associated with this, I kind of got into this already, but the scheduling and resource allocation problem is a very, very hard problem, partly just because of how complex the process is, and partly because you're trying to solve this for various different setups. We want Filecoin to be something where folks can operate on in the order of some gigabytes to our largest miners who are well above that. And so trying to build a piece of software that can run well in both those setups has all of the appropriate knobs to turn depending on whether you're the smallest or largest storage provider in the network, but also that where the config isn't overwhelming, so that your users still actually know what's going on and know how to use the software in the best way to meet their goals, is a complicated process. This is also one of the pieces of Lotus that's the most user-facing, where we get the most feedback, and so the feedback loop, having a good feedback loop where folks can confidently explain to you what they need or why what you have currently isn't quite right for them, and then being able to deliver, test, and iterate with that gets really, really important. The other challenge that I'll quickly call on is recovery from fail states. Like I said, this process is somewhere between 7 and 11 steps, and each of them are expensive, intensive steps. And so if one of them does go wrong, you really don't want to lose all your previous work. You really want to be able to recover from that and keep moving, redo the step that failed, identify what failed, redo it, and then keep moving, because if not, that represents a lot of lost work. And that essentially leads to a very, very complicated state machine problem, where you're trying to identify which bad state you got into and what the best good state that you can confidently fall back on is. Cool. And lastly, the community. As I mentioned, it is our job to support users of Lotus as they use the software. This has the basic stuff: provide documentation, troubleshoot issues, find areas of improvement. As mentioned, we kind of become, in some ways, the face of the Filecoin project and the Filecoin protocol to our users. So making sure that our users know what's going on in Filecoin land, what stage the Filecoin virtual machine, what stage of development that's at, or what's coming up in 2023, kind of falls on us as the vehicle of information. We run multiple test networks for the Filecoin ecosystem to test on, and in partnership with a dedicated infrastructure team. And a lot of this work that I'm describing is increasingly done in partnership with the Filecoin Foundation, who helped put this event together today. So there's a lot of fun collaboration across teams there. And the key challenges are roughly what you'd expect. Lotus and all of this is a complex piece of software, and explaining and debugging issues with your users can be very, very complicated. This is not, coming up with a list of 10 frequently asked questions does not cut it with something like Lotus, so you often do need very, very hands-on debugging and troubleshooting. Bringing order to the fast-moving crypto world where people are distracted or excited by something new every day. This is one of the most interesting challenges, is you wind up having to try to be the voice that's like, yes, yes, we know that's happening, but this is what we're talking about in July. This is what's being delivered in the Filecoin network. Yes, we know this other thing over there is exciting, but like this is what's happening in this month. This is the network upgrade and so on. You almost become the roadmap keepers, working across various team boundaries, as I mentioned, including the Filecoin Foundation. And the last point, as I mentioned, I think you wind up not representing just the code that you're building, but also the efforts of various teams upstream of you that are getting shipped through Lotus. Because if we go back to this picture and look at kind of protocol and network or the blockchain pieces, there's a lot that's actively changing that gets shipped through Lotus. So as an example, if we have some, the Filecoin virtual machine is a great example of this, which emerged from a different team doing essentially cutting edge research, came close to delivery, and now it almost becomes our job to make sure that that gets out into the network, users know how to use it, any pitfalls that users will face get proactively addressed, and so on. Which brings me to our secret fifth mission, which often takes up a good amount of our time, which is basically shipping the work of the folks upstream. So proofs are an example of this, where there's active work always being done on our proofs of replication. There are even ideas for how to replace the proof of replication that we currently have with new, better versions that could come in the years to come, or research-based projects. And it becomes our job to integrate this, test it from end to end, including on those test networks, and then connect these teams with their users, because we tend to function as the interface to those users. And that this is honestly some of the most exciting work that we have, because very selfishly, it means that we are always at the forefront of whatever is exciting in the Filecoin protocol. When Filecoin was launching, we were the team that was putting out the software to launch the protocol. If the FVM is happening this year, right now we're talking to all of these users that are going to be running FVM nodes as of tomorrow. Whatever is happening in 2023, hopefully it'll be delivered through Lotus and through the other implementations, and you get to always stay in the hot lane, which I find very, very fun, if a little exhausting. Cool. So any questions or points of discussion? Cool. So some quick facts that I just wanted to throw at you. We're keeping good for time. So yeah, the Lotus team, Jennifer gave an introduction of this earlier, but the Lotus team it's actually one of the smaller implementation teams in Filecoin. We've got 4 engineers, both 4 software developers and 4 technical support engineers and our TPM that live within the Protocol Labs Entress org, written in Golang. Make dir Lotus, the command that created Lotus, was run 3 years ago now in June 2019, so we're 3 years old. And we are heavily reliant on kind of this core PLN stack. So we use the Golang implementations of libp2p for our peer-to-peer communication, IPFS for our block store, and IPLD for everything, including car files and our data coming in and so on. So this is kind of my takeaway about what is working on Lotus like, and why am I personally excited to work on Lotus. We're a small team. We built a relatively small piece of software. It's complicated and it can often be overwhelming, but in the grand scheme of things, it's like 4 to 8 repositories that we're actively working on at any given time. But those 4 to 8 repositories built by the 4 to 8 people on the Lotus team is the foundation of one of the largest information storage systems in human history. And that is cool. It is incredible to have that kind of impact from a team of relatively, informal, very smart, very talented, humble engineers building something like this. It is great. And if anyone here is interested, that is why you should consider working on the Lotus team. But that is the pitch that I wanted to make today. I'm happy to take any questions now. Thank you for your listening. Question. Yeah, it's a good question. So regression testing honestly falls into a few different components when you're building something like Lotus. One big one is consensus regressions. Because the Filecoin protocol is evolving quickly, we want to make sure that that no change that we're making breaks historical consensus. And so one of the ways we go about that is just by doing historical imports, making sure that Lotus can always continue to sync the Filecoin chain start to finish. Kind of on a more like performance and more like almost like pressure testing. That is something that we are actively working on more than anything else. But a lot of that comes down to relying on our users who are very, very diverse. So who are running in very different settings, running with very different use cases in mind, and requiring Lotus to serve different purposes. And so keeping a close feedback loop with our users is often how questions around scalability or recent breakages get caught. Because it is pretty hard to try and cover every possible user of Lotus, just because of the breadth of our users. That's a good question, though, and something we need to be thinking more about. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Simple question is, there's a commercial product where I don't need to know what a code or anything about crypto, and I can say, upload this new
Is there? If there is, it is not Lotus today. And so, yeah, I think, and I don't think Lotus should be that product. That's my personal opinion. I think so. Products like that are being built. Estuary is the example that comes to mind, which generally build either on top of Lotus or with Lotus somewhere in the background, with the goal of abstracting all of the complexity that I just mentioned away from the end user. And I do think that is going to be critical to fully unlocking Filecoin's potential, because we don't want, much as I love Lotus, we don't want someone who just wants to store data on Filecoin to have to think about Lotus or to start a Lotus node. We really want that abstracted away, and there's a lot of work happening towards that. Yep.
What would it take for me to run my own node, and when I upload that movie, where does it go? Is it on every single node, or?
Yeah, good question. What does it take to run your own Lotus node? A relatively an above average computer is what I would say. You probably cannot, you can run a Lotus node on any machine, including your laptop. You will have a hard time syncing the main network using a laptop, but a good desktop will do it. I run one on my kind of above average desktop. And then that is your kind of insight into the Filecoin blockchain. So if you want information about the Filecoin blockchain, or to like move Filecoin data around or make deals, storage and retrieval deals, you can do that with your Lotus node. When you upload that movie, it does not go to every node on the Filecoin blockchain. That is not the point of Filecoin. It goes to the storage provider that you are interested in storing that data with, and you kind of, Lotus helps you negotiate that process by essentially giving you a list of storage providers, telling you what they're charging for this deal, and asking you to pick one. So no, you transfer your data to that storage provider. The storage provider, who may or may not be running Lotus Miner, goes through that sealing process that I described over the span of, let's say, 6 hours, and on-chain submits a message that describes the data that you have asked them to store. And thanks to content address data and crypto magic, the entire chain and yourselves can be sure that you have created a unique replica of this data, even though all they know about the data is a hash, essentially. So yeah, good question. Anyone else? Yes? Great question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so we are more than actively hiring. We are interested in hiring SWEs kind of at all levels. We are very interested in hiring both junior and senior software engineers. Things that we, work that I think is probably currently being under prioritized on the Lotus team involves a lot of community building and project management or project facing things. For instance, we can do more of these talks, and so need people who are capable of traveling and going out there in the community to represent Lotus. We're really interested in shoring up our DevOps and infra capabilities because that is an important part of work on the Lotus team. So if you have a background in that, we're very interested in talking. Yeah, I think those are the three chief ones that I'll mention. But honestly, everyone is welcome. PRs are also welcome. If you don't want to join the Lotus team but just want to contribute, we have 500 open issues in our GitHub repo that you can help close out. Cool. Any last questions? I don't know if I have a time limit, but I'm at the top of the hour, so it's a good time. Yeah, so definitely non-technical roles are of interest. Kind of as I mentioned, establishing a presence and helping establish Lotus presence in the broader Filecoin community. The broader Filecoin effort is also very interested in more marketing people, both at the foundation and kind of within the Protocol Labs umbrella. So yeah, I think I have a link. Maybe I don't, but I can share a link for our open postings that you should definitely take a look at. Any last questions? It's 3 o'clock. This one, she has all the colors and she's the best one. Cool, thanks a lot, folks. Thank you again, Phil Swan and Orbit for hosting us, and thanks for listening.